Today on Tri-Cities Magazine, host Erik D'Souza interviews Rick Antanson, author of Train Beyond the Mountains, Journeys on the Rocky Mountaineer. For reasons that will become obvious, this interview was shot on location at the Port Moody Station Museum.
Hello, and welcome to Tri-Cities Magazine. I'm Erik D'Souza, and joining me today is travel writer Rick Antanson. Rick has written 5 travel books and 8 books in total. But today, he's coming home, and we're going to be talking about his trip and his new book about trains beyond the mountains, where he takes the Rocky Mountaineer. So, hi, Rick.
Nice to be here. Appreciate it very much.
So, first question. I've read the beginning of your book, and clearly you love trains. So what is it about trains that, the romanticism about them that keeps making you want to write about them?
Trains are fascinating historically, particularly when you think of steam engines, but also where they go. The routes were carved, whether it was across America or across Europe, and they often were newfound outlets for people to go on journeys. And the trains define everything that's best about travel. They're relaxing. It's just like a long walk without the footwork. You get forced to ponder what's going on outside the windows because there's nowhere else to go. When we were on Rocky Mountaineer, I was with my grandson, Riley, who was 10 at the time, lives in Port Moody, and we felt like we were traveling with the United Nations. There were a bunch of people from Australia in our coach, people from Germany, a lady from Japan, lots of people in the United States, fellow Canadians, and there's just something about that. The writer Paul Theroux said that train travel is the last word in truth serum, because people just tell you their stories. So as a writer, I love that.
You told me that often what makes a great train ride is the company you keep. So you're traveling this with your grandson,
yes.
Which I have young kids and I couldn't fathom being fun. But why was it so fun for you to travel with Riley?
Well, part of it is, many of my other books have been about places that you and I couldn't travel to today. We couldn't go to Timbuktu because we'd be kidnapped. We wouldn't be allowed access to join an expedition to the summit of Mount Ararat that I wrote about in a book called Full Moon over Noah's Ark. And because of things like that, we couldn't go on Papua New Guinea on the trek that I was there. So there's something about being on the Rocky Mountaineer that makes it really approachable for everyone. But to be traveling with a young companion, this grandson, he was 10 at the time, so everything he saw was through a set of eyes that were 1/7 the age of mine. And his perception, his education, his worldliness, all of that, I was 7 times that, but it didn't always show because he was smart, he was articulate, and he was really sarcastic, which made him quite enjoyable to be traveling with. He loved the trip. He would say that sometimes he didn't quite know what to do with his time, so he had his tablet. Other times, he became fascinated with the observation deck, and he would spend hours there. Between this great breakfast and this great lunch, he would be on the observation deck, hanging over the railing, fascinated by what was going by the train.
Also, in the book, it says that you've traveled around the world, 35 countries in total, and 8 provinces. Which provinces were left out?
So, right, I've had the good fortune to be through 8 provinces by train, and of course, Prince Edward Island's difficult to do by that, and Newfoundland. Mm-hmm. So those would be absent. I've had the good fortune to be on a train through 28 or 30 American states, and as you say, on train on 35 countries. 36 now, because I recently was on another one a couple of weeks ago in Europe. So, and those have been quite varied countries. But I will say, there are still 90 or so countries in the world that I have never been to, and many of them have trains, and I want to get on those trains one day.
Well, this is home for you. So
yes.
And you've been to BC, I'm sure you've been to Alberta many, many times. Other than traveling with your grandson, what was special about taking this train at this time that was worth writing a book about?
Well, we've each had lots of travels. Many viewers will have had great travels with great situations, and they come home and they're very satisfied. It's common that a 2-week or a month-long trip would support a magazine article or a posting. It's rare that a travel experience can sustain a book-length treatment. That takes loads of incidents and heaps of anecdotes. It needs that. What made this special in part was traveling with grandson Riley, so you've got this intergenerational travel perspective, what one Australian on the train called legacy travel. They just loved the notion of that. And leaving a legacy of ideas and perceptions with a younger generation. But I think for me personally, being on the Rocky Mountaineer reflected that it's been operating for 30-some years now. When it began in the early 90s, I had the opportunity. I was the vice president of sales and marketing and loose ends. Everything was new. And being there at that time, the coaches were old. The view wasn't always that great, even if the scenery was fantastic. Now, there are two-level dome cars, as one of the people from somewhere else in the world nicknamed it the glass train, because you look up, you can see those mountain peaks everywhere. You see wildlife, you see all sorts of things. But I wanted to see how the train had itself changed and evolved over those 3 decades. So that made it fascinating on a personal level. But this is British Columbia. I mean, this is where the railway linked British Columbia with the Eastern Canada and made us the country, the nation we are today. We are held together by a ribbon of steel.
To anyone watching, they'll see our background, that we're on a train. We should tell everybody that this is not the Rocky Mountaineer. We're actually in Port Moody at the Station Museum. Port Moody holds a special significance when it comes to Canadian Railway. I'm sure many people know a little bit about it, but you're the man to tell us a lot about it.
Well, Port Moody was to be the terminus for the Canadian Pacific Railway. And when the last spike was driven in 1885, this was where the eastbound railway was being built up to meet in Craigellachie with the westbound drive under William Van Horn, who had this vision. And so the railway began with Port Moody as the terminus. And it was to get goods from across the country onto the ships. Now, William Van Horn, much to the regret of business people in Port Moody and land speculators and others who had invested heavily here, people who had moved here were farming and doing other things in the district, he decided to move the terminus from Port Moody to an area then called Hastings or Granville or Gastown, today known as Vancouver. The work yards were moved from Yale and the Fraser Canyon to a work field in that new vicinity, which they nicknamed Yale Town, with all of the work there. The roundhouse went there. All of that happened. But Port Moody was initially the western linchpin in completing the Canadian Pacific Railway and ensuring that British Columbia became part of the nation of Canada, withstanding pressure from these new states of Oregon and Washington. Keeping in mind that the year Canada was formed by 4 provinces in the east in 1867, that's the year the United States bought Alaska from Russia. So this colony of Victoria, this colony here of which became British Columbia, it was bookended top and bottom by what was becoming the United States of America, and the ambition to have all of this become part of the United States. That was their view. And gold miners, American gold miners from California, were coming up for the Fraser River Gold Rush, coming up through Port Moody. So Port Moody is key to how the country of Canada became the nation we love today.
Rick, you clearly know your history, and I've been reading your book, and one thing I love about your book is that you do infuse a lot of the history of British Columbia and Canada into your book, and you're talking about some of the early map makers. You also have some beautiful maps in this book. So why the maps? And to me, as a reader, I enjoy the maps, but obviously it's an important part of the book. It was important to you. So why the maps?
Well, I'm a map guy, and in a published book, The publisher has lots of authority because it's their investment. They can choose the title, the cover. They're doing the design. They're investing in the editing of the book. They've got lots of say. But if there are to be maps, which again is the publisher's decision, yes or no, the author is to provide them. I've always lobbied the publisher of all 5 of my travel books to include maps. Sometimes they don't, because in literary travel, it's the narrative has to carry all of the weight. They sometimes don't have photographs, sometimes don't have an index. But the maps are important to me. I'm a map guy. And like yourself, they add something to me, and I spend time musing over them. But the story of exploration, for example, in Western Canada, you've got Russia coming along the coast. You've got the Spanish coming up. You've got Portuguese sort of kicking about. You've got the British. You've got lots of investigation trying to find a Northwest Passage. Well, I wanted to show that on a map. But around the same time, a little bit later, you've got David Thompson, himself known as the map maker. You've got Simon Fraser. You've got Alexander Mackenzie, the first person to go from the eastern coast to the western coast. The first, for sure, non-Indigenous person. But because Indigenous people didn't travel great distances, he was probably the first person to do that. 12 years before Lewis and Clark did it in the States. In fact, the American president gave Lewis and Clark a copy of Alexander Mackenzie's book to say, here's how it's done.
That's true, and all those explorers did get a lot of support from the Indigenous people. I don't think they could have done it without that, right? They probably would have starved to death.
You hit it. They would. The fur trade couldn't have made it without the help of the Indigenous peoples. The early explorers couldn't have made it. Not even often as a matter of safety because of Indigenous guides, but also the welcoming of Indigenous peoples. Now that wasn't always returned with the type of respect it should have earned. A lot of diseases that decimated Indigenous populations were brought from Europeans via the oceans when they were coming and exploring, and that was terrible. And we know, we just lived through the pandemic. We know how that can pause life, but that was nothing compared to the devastation of smallpox and lots of other European-born diseases coming and being visited upon the Indigenous peoples. But in North America, the Indigenous peoples helped with exploration, they helped with the fur trade, they helped in many, many ways of facilitating the integration into the land. And of course then the railways came, the railway, first the CP, and then others, CPR, and then Canadian National and others. When they came, they brought large numbers of settlers, and whether it was on the prairies or eventually into British Columbia. And that, of course, further eroded the lands under the control of the First Nations peoples. And that's more acknowledged and respected in 2023 than it was in 1823 or in even 1923.
That's true. Rick, I very much enjoy talking with you. I very much enjoy reading your book. It's a nice slice of humor, history, geography, knowing where we are now on the world and knowing where we were. So, pleasure talking to you, Rick.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me aboard.
And thank you, everyone. This was another episode of Tri-City Magazine, and have a good day.